Welcome to our third in our series of In Conversations With that we've had over the past few weeks. This is our penultimate evening. And thank you for everyone's feedback. It's been good. We've got three sort of quite distinct audiences, really. We've got the group of us on Zoom, and then we've got those watching along on Facebook Live or catching up once it's done. And then a good number of people who've been catching up on YouTube as well. So I think across the three different audiences, which are probably a little bit different from one another, it's been really good to have you all with us. And I think we've had some really good conversations. I know people have really appreciated them. So thank you for joining us, Harry. It's really good to have you with us tonight. Harry, you've got lots of strings to your bow, lots of different things that you do and are involved with. I thought rather than me trying to sort of introduce you and doing a bad job, do you want to tell us some of the things that you're involved with?
Yes. So first and foremost, I am a poet. I am lucky enough to do that full time. I studied maths at university and used to write poems for fun on the side. And now poetry is my full-time thing. I've started doing maths for fun on the side, which surprised me as much as anyone. But that takes all kinds of forms. So I got into it through these poetry slam competitions, which was a way of trying to make it more exciting for the audience, taking it in turns to perform. But all of that just meant that there was an emphasis on trying to connect with people, whether that was by making them laugh, giving them goosebumps, making them cry even. It was all about that human interaction. And that's something I've always loved to bring into my work. And then the past few years, I've been doing stuff with my friend Chris, who's a musician, and that's come under the very specific genre of comedy rap jazz, because we figured the more niche the genre, the more we could rise to the top of it. So we invented a new genre so we could conquer it. And that's amazing to have a best mate to tour the country with and do that kind of thing. And so there's the poetry, there's the music, in amongst it, there's other kinds of writing as well. But mainly anything with words is exciting and appealing to me.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for the intro. So I think we got to start with the maths. I think so. You're a maths graduate, that's right, yeah?
Yes.
So how did the whole maths poetry thing come about? How does that connect?
So for so long, I maintained that they were very separate things, and maths was appealing to me because there were definite right answers and things would slot into place and it was satisfying and it all made sense. And often the world feels like it might not make sense. So that felt like a safe place to retreat to. Whereas poetry for me was the opposite. It was complete freedom. You could be creative, you could be expressive. There were no rules as far as I was concerned. However, the more that I sat with both, especially studying maths at a kind of higher level, it drifts into more abstract philosophy at points. And I think for me now, looking back on it, they are both about searching for answers and about trying to figure out the world around us and using what you have to search for more, whether that is with numbers, whether that is words. It's more than just setting up rigid rules. I think it is about appreciating the world around you. And so I've come to learn that they do work side by side. And another thing they have in common is a lot of people don't like them. So I have to try and convince them it's worth their time to see me talk about either.
Fantastic. So did you have any background in sort of poetry or English or any sort of study on it? How did you sort of fall into something quite different in a sense?
Yes. So, I mean, one of the reasons why I love getting to perform with Chris now is that we both went to school together. So from a very young age, we would be performing on stages. And for me, my first introduction to writing and lyricism was music. And I used to love listening to music, whether it was singer-songwriters or hip hop and rap stuff. It was always the lyricism that would jump out to me. And so as a teenager, wanted to be in a band, very quickly learned that I couldn't sing or play guitar. And so decided if I wrote lyrics, I could do them over other people playing music. And so our school had a Battle of the Bands competition, and I would write lyrics and rap them over all my friends playing guitar far too loudly, and people couldn't really hear what I was saying, but it was exciting to be up on stage sharing that. And then I discovered these poetry open mic nights and realized that actually when the words were given space to sit by themselves, there was more room for people to take it in and interact with it. And so I discovered this whole world of spoken word poetry. But by that point, I was doing all maths and science subjects. So I never studied it in an academic sense. I came into it sideways and just was so inspired by other performers and people that I saw. And so through that, I've kind of tumbled into this world of poetry and found things that I love, whether it is written or performed, but I've never really had that formal training in the same sense.
Brilliant. Well, that sounds good to me. And I saw from your social media today, I've got to admit, I didn't know, is it National Numeracy Day?
It is, and it would be remiss of me as an ambassador for National Numeracy Day to not mention it. This is one of the other things that I've loved, having come back into maths and being able to own it and celebrate it, is there is a whole world up there. And I think for so many people, they think maths is not for them, or they're put off it from a young age. And actually, it's so essential to so many areas of our life that it's been really fun to get involved with that. So today, my main role was writing a sort of number rap and having primary school children around the country perform their own number raps. And my favorite one was these two very small children came up with the line, "When I'm at home and I'm eating my grapes, it makes me realize they are 3D shapes." And I think that's as good as anything I could come up with.
That's a proud moment.
Exactly.
Harry, now we've talked about maths and poetry. Can you perform something that combines those two genres together?
Yes. So having told myself the two are very separate, I realized one of the first things I ever wrote was a poem about maths. And it was specifically for an event that was all around prime numbers. And a lot of these other poems felt like specific rhyming Wikipedia articles. But I liked prime numbers because they're the ones that don't quite fit in. They don't quite follow the patterns we expect. And so I tried to make more of a story out of it. And this is that story. And it's called 59. 59 wakes up on the wrong side of the bed, realizes all his hair is on one side of his head, takes just under a minute to work out that is because of the way that he slept. He finds some clothes and gets dressed. Now he can help but look in the mirror and be subtly impressed how he looks rough around the edges and yet casually messed. And as he glances out the window, sees the slightly asbestos width of 60 from across the street. Now 60 was beautiful. Perfectly trimmed cuticles, dressed in something suitable and never rude or crude at all. Unimprovable, right on time as usual, more on cue than a snooker ball, but had to play is super cool. 59 wanted to tell her that he knew her favorite flower. He thought of her every second, every minute, every hour, but he knew it would not work. He would never get the girl because the laws shifted across the street. They came from different worlds of 59 and my 60's perfectly round figure. 60 thought 59 was odd. You see, one of his favorite films was 101 Dalmatians. She preferred the sequel. He romanticized the idea they were star-crossed lovers. They could overcome the odds and evens because they had each other, while she maintained his views not about a mother that separate could not be equal. And though at the time he felt stupid and dumb, but trying to love a girl controlled by her stupid mum, should have been comforted by that simple something 59 away from 60, and you're left with the one. And sure enough, after 2 months of moping around, 61 days later, 61 was who he found. He had lost his keys and his parents were out. So one day after calling around to houses, he noticed the slightly wonky numbers on the door. He wondered why he never introduced himself before. She let him in, his jaw dropped in awe. 61 was like 60, with a little bit more. So she had prettier eyes and an approachable smile. Unlike him, rough around the edges, casual style. Unlike him, everything was disorganized palms. Unlike him, mom didn't find a friend. Her mom didn't find a friend, stayed a while because she was like him and he liked her. I reckon she would like him and she knew he was like her, and it was different this time. I mean, this girl was wicked, so he plucked up the courage and asked for her digits. She said, "I'm 61. He grinned, said, "I'm 59 and today I've had a really nice time. So tomorrow, if you wanted, you could come over to mine." She said, "Sure." She loved talking to someone just as quirky. So she agreed to this unofficial first date. In the end, it was only ready 1 minute early, but it did not matter because she arrived 1 minute late. And from that moment on, there was non-stop chatter. How they loved X Factor, how they had two factors, how that did not matter. Distinctiveness made them better. By the end of the night, they went together, and one day she was talking about stuck-up 60. She noticed that 59 looked a bit shifty. He blushed and told her of his crush, the best thing that never happened because it led to us. And 61 was clever, see, not prone to jealousy. She looked him in the eyes and she told him quite tenderly, "You're 59, I'm 61. Together we combine to become twice what 60 could ever be." And at this point, 59 had tears in his eyes. He was so glad to have this one-of-a-kind girl in his life. He told her the very definition of being prime was the one himself could his heart divide, and she was the one he wanted to give his heart to. She said she felt the same, and now she knew the ones were half true because that wasn't real love. That love was just a sample. When it came to real love, they were a prime example. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Harry. Thank you. It's brilliant. Thank you. Oh, swap sides of the screen. Excellent. This is going to be fun. Now, I have a question from my daughter. I'm going to play favourites here. And she's desperate to know, what's the first poem you ever wrote?
So the first poem I have record of was when I was 13 years old. My school had a poetry competition that was sponsored by Divine, who make fair trade chocolate. And so the theme of the competition was a vision for the future. But one of the prizes on offer was, quote unquote, a year's supply of chocolate. And so 13-year-old me thought my vision for the future is chocolate. And so I just wrote this poem all about chocolate using lots of very dodgy rhymes. But even at that age, I loved language and what you could do with it. And I won this prize for this competition, which was a year's supply of chocolate. And it did not last close to a year. But I think 13-year-old me thought poetry is a good thing because it can get you chocolate. And that was enough to keep me going. But it was a few years since then before I thought about writing poetry for fun. I only ever tried it if it was homework in English or if there was something like a competition. I hadn't considered that it might just be something to do in my spare time. But I think even at a very young age, I loved reading poems, whether it was Michael Rose and Benjamin Zephaniah, Roger McGough, that was kind of fun and nonsense and silly, but also had that heart to it as well. And I was aware of the power that language could have to be both fun and moving. But it wasn't until, later in my teens that I thought of writing my own feelings and not just writing about a geography project or chocolate or whatever it might be.
Sure. Well, I think we'll come to that question of the heart of your poetry, I think, in a while. I'm always really interested when I talk to creative people about their sort of creative process. I wonder about how you approach writing. Is there a formula? Do you think today I'm going to write something, or does it sort of strike you from somewhere sort of left field that you're not quite expecting? Obviously, you've written a book of poems. How does all that sort of operate for you?
Yeah, it's ever changing. And I think especially the last 18 months or so, it's changed even more because for me, often it does come from some kind of spark, whether that is being asked about prime numbers or whether it's coming across a story or meeting a person that's a bit inspiring or having this theme. And from there, I think it's a free for all. I'll make a mind map, write down as much as I can, whether it's puns about numbers or whether it is different things. And at that point, anything goes. And it feels really exciting. And you map it out and make this whole world bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it comes to the point of editing it down and slotting things together and trying to make it work. And when I first started, because these poetry slams had a 3-minute time limit on it, that was quite a good thing to aim towards. Whereas more recently, I've been trying to work towards my next book of poems, and that feels a lot tougher for me in a way, because when I write a poem and then I share it with an audience, I can tell quite instantly if it works or not, or if it's close to kind of having the effect that I hope it might. Whereas without having that audience to test stuff on, I've learned to work out what it is that I want to say and what feels important, and actually try and have enough faith in the words themselves that it's not just seeking validation from an audience, or not just depending on my wife as my only audience member for the last year, because that's unfair to her. But I think it's interesting that this constantly changes. And so when I started writing, I was a teenager, and the things that felt important to me were fitting in or working out who you were, and those themes come back again and again in my work. And now, 10 years on, some of those things still feel relevant and still feel exciting and important, and there are other things that come in. And so I try to always write about things that feel real or feel truthful to where I'm at, and whether or not they stand the test of time, I don't think that's the be all and end all. I think it's more important to be honest, to write from the place that you're in, and that can be fun and that can be serious. And I think part of the challenge is holding both of those spaces together.
I think you mentioned some of the performative element of your poetry, and I've got a question from a friend of our benefice, or our two benefices here, Ruth Wells, who's a priest and a poet, performance poet, and she asked the question. She says, "I'd be interested in the performance aspect of Harry's work. Does he have performance in mind when he writes? Is there a difference between writing poems to be read to yourself and spoken word performed for others?"
Yes, and for me, again, in the last year, the things that I've written have become a lot more reflective and have felt like they've been written for me or to be shared in an online space or as a written poem for people to read rather than as an interactive thing in an audience. And I think partly having the process of performing with Chris has been interesting because that is framed as comedy and that's music and it's high energy and it's all about bouncing off an audience. And so actually now, if there's an idea that feels more interactive, it tends to float towards that space. Whereas if there's something that feels more personal or more reflective, maybe I'll hold it for Poetry World. And so almost everything I write, I do speak out loud as I do it, whether or not it's designed to be performed to an audience. The sound of it and the rhythm and the rhyme are still important. So even the most personal, vulnerable poems that I might not want to share necessarily in a public sphere, they are still written to be performed in a sense, even if that's just me performing them to a brick wall in my own house. I think it's part of how I got into it was the way that words sound and how they feel out loud. So there will always be that aspect to it, but I've learned through the art of writing and distilling my thoughts down onto the page that actually sometimes the writing is the end point and it doesn't need to be shared with someone to feel complete or to feel like it's been a worthwhile process.
Sure. Well, in a moment, we'll ask you to maybe perform another one for us. But before we get there, as we've talked a bit about performance, maybe just for a bit of fun, tell us about the worst gig you've ever had, or maybe the most surreal gig that you've ever had. Maybe they're one and the same, more weird than joining us in deepest, darkest Dorset on a Wednesday evening.
Well, it's interesting because there's been a few gigs during this time that are, and it's amazing how used to it you get. And I think things like this are amazing because actually in a time when we felt more disconnected, we've been able to connect with each other. And earlier this week, I was performing to a secondary school in Kentucky from my own bedroom, and things like that feel amazing. But the downside to the Zoom thing is you can't get a lot back from your audience necessarily. But I did quite early on during the pandemic, I did a school session where the students were encouraged to turn their microphones off so they didn't interrupt, but also their cameras off. And so that was just me for an hour just performing poems to a blank screen, and that's such a surreal thing, and there's no sense of interaction or adrenaline or that kind of thing. So even now, and I hope it doesn't feel too needy, as I perform my poems, I'll be looking at you as if you're there in front of me, or the people in the Zoom and the gallery view, because I'm reminded that there are other people there and it's not just me by myself. But I think the flip side of that, the worst gigs that come to mind are the ones where people are not only not listening but actively sort of don't want to be there. And so I did a gig, and I was on my way up to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, so the first time ever I was going to be doing a whole month of shows, so arguably a point where I needed to be building up my confidence, not the other way around. And it was a church outreach event in Birmingham, and it was in this big sort of green square. There was bouncy castle, other stuff, really kind of exciting atmosphere. But just before I went on to perform some poems, a local death metal group came on to perform, and they encouraged the audience to form what I now know to be called a wall of death, where the two sides of the audience split apart, and then during the peak moment of the song ran together and had a mosh pit. And because they were an out and out sort of Christian death metal group, they made sure that they reminded people if anyone fell over in the mosh pit to help each other out. So it was quite a loving tone to it, but also it did sort of scare away any potential poetry fans. And at that moment, it happened to be National Dress Up Like a Zombie Day, and a parade of zombies walked across in the background. So all of this was going on, and then I started performing my poems, and then there was some drunk guy as well who made his way and unplugged the sound system and just shouted at me, "Why the hell are you rapping about bees?" Because that was a poem that I had at the time. So all of that felt like sort of signs from the universe that maybe I shouldn't be investing my whole life into this. But thankfully, it didn't deter me, and I carried on. And actually, that whole month in Edinburgh, even when there were gigs, when there weren't many people there at all, I thought, at least I'm not being shouted at or surrounded by zombies, or I'm in fear for my personal safety. So I think, as with all of these things, the worst moments actually become lifelines you hold on to, because it can only get better from there.
Sure. Well, there might not be huge amounts of us tonight, but we promise not to shout at you. I think
That's very kind.
we can promise that. Do you want to share another poem with us?
Yes, just because I referenced it just then, I will do the Bumblebee one, because also I think talking about the heart behind my poems, this is one of the ones that quite early on I realized that it started through a love of language and essentially trying to find as many rhymes as possible for the word bumble. And then I came across this story that scientists once proved, or thought they could prove, that bumblebees shouldn't be able to fly. By the conventional methods they understood, they said it was impossible. But obviously bees can fly. So I love this idea of this tiny little insect doing its thing, not really caring what anyone says, and trying to hold on to that and take it to be something I could apply to my life at the time. So this is called The Scientist and the Bumblebee. And if for the ambiance you want to imagine there's some zombies in the background, by all means go for it. You see, the scientist said the bumblebee couldn't fly. She lacked the wing beats per minute or the necessary size. But the bumblebee in her ignorance proved him wrong. She knew that she could fly because she'd flown all along, and now imagine if she'd listened to that man, she might have stopped, given up on the spot, tucked her wings in and dropped. So don't ever let someone tell you what you can't do, because just because it's proven doesn't mean it's true. The bumblebee bumbled. Loving her life, she hums as she flies. Bzzz. The bumblebee fumbled, clumsily stumbled from flower to flower. Bzzz. The bumblebee tumbled, tore through the sky, pulling corkscrews and dives, and then the bumblebee mumbled, crumbled in front of the queen and her power. Bzzz. The bumblebee grumbled something explicit, discovered she'd been labeled a gimmick, and then the bumblebee rumbled, desperate to eat that nectar so sweet. The bumblebee humbled her critics, silenced all things scientific, and then zip, the bumblebee jumbled her speech. She did not care, because in the air she was free, because she was a busy bee. Loved to fly to flowers and visit trees, deliver seeds efficiently, more so than in a breeze, intricate, intimate, meticulous, auxiliary, and gather more honey than any sick MCs. You see, ever since she learned to fly, she'd earned her stripes. Despite the words of hype from learned types, suppressed the urge to fight or turn and hide, insouciant for sky and birds up high, her confidence was soaring. She saw scientists as boring, the sort of people she should be ignoring because they made no sense. At least no scent as sweet as pollen, even centimeters from her, they depended on their drawings. They would rather follow their charts than follow their hearts. If they saw a bee leave, they still believed the grass to preferred facts and figures, the bees wax and figure, but she begged the differ. She flew past and laughed. Now meet the scientist. His aim in life was to try and dismiss any hypothesis he deemed preposterous. When asked why he never swallowed his pride, he replied that is obvious. It would have fit down my esophagus. And his full proof was full proof, except for the truth. If the bumblebee had read his report, she'd have agreed she was too heavy, therefore she'd never be airborne, but ignorance is bliss. And that begins with a B. So this one is for the bees in the hives living lives of aviation. The ones who survive and survive through pollination, the ones that thrive in those sticky situations with their flocking or hilly-pillification. They are doing what they're doing for the buzz, not for love or money, moving and maneuvering above if the weather's sunny, proving so the humans, their conclusions are confusing and unusually refusing to budge. This is for those who are being themselves and who believe in themselves. who see the bee in themselves and set it free in themselves, who know that even though it's difficult, life is full of miracles and true happiness never came from being cynical. The bumblebee, forever looking for something sweet, overcoming tumbleweed by holding on to some belief. In summary, this is for those that stay summary, and there'll be bees to come, whatever comes to be, because the scientists said the bumblebee couldn't fly. She lacked the wing beats per minute or the necessary size, but the bumblebee in her ignorance proved them wrong. She knew she could fly because she'd flown all along, and now imagine if she'd listened to that man, she might have stopped, given up on the spot, tucked her wings and dropped. So don't ever let someone tell you what you can't do, because just because it's proven doesn't mean it's true. Thank you.
Thanks, Harry. As we kind of think a bit maybe about the heart of your poetry and the soul of it, or the spirituality, faith of it maybe. I've already referenced it, but the Greenbelt Festival, and I know it's something that I'm familiar with, and I think it's something you've grown up within. Do you want to explain to anyone that doesn't know what the Greenbelt Festival is? Because I know it's sort of home for you in some sense.
Yes, so I think I've been to Greenbelt every year of my life, bar one. So I grew up going there, and it is it's an arts festival, but the three brands of it are faith, arts, and justice. And for me, I love that those three things are seen as side by side. And actually, the social aspect of it is as important as the religious side of things, and the arts are held as much. So, you know, I see artists that I love, and I see inspiring talks, and I get to go to early morning prayer, and all of these things are side by side. And actually, of all of the Christian festivals out there, it's the one I'm most likely to invite non-Christian friends to as well, because I think there is less of a language or vocabulary barrier perhaps to people who haven't experienced that. And I just think in general it's a fantastic space. So for me, growing up as a teenager, going somewhere where creativity and faith were intertwined and were seen as almost one and the same was such an encouraging thing, so that when I started writing and performing, it wasn't a choice between that and my faith, but actually it was an expression of who I am and who I feel I am in the eyes of a creator, in terms of God, as well as in this amazing world that we're in, and the ability to be creative in that sense.
Sure. One of the things we've been sort of talking about with our guests over the last few weeks, or one of the things I'm particularly interested in, partly because I'm writing a long dissertation about it, is there's almost this divide, I think, that sometimes people have, that there's the secular and there's the sacred kind of parts of life, and there's these different boxes that we kind of put those things in. I guess Greenbelt sort of always resists, I think, as you said, sort of compartmentalizing those different things of, this is the faith part of life, this is the work part of life, this is the whatever part of life. And I wonder how faith kind of collides or underpins kind of your work as a poet, as your work as a performer. How do you sort of see that relationship going on?
Yeah, so I think when I did start growing up in a church context, I felt very fortunate there was a space to be creative in amongst that. And so it's always been a celebration of who I am and what I believe. And then for me, finding spoken word poetry as an outlet, there is a lot of overlap with that. And I've seen performers and poets who, to my mind, are modern day prophets, and they're able to articulate things and speak into and of the world around us in a way that opens your eyes and changes the way you feel about things. And for me, that is as powerful as many a Sunday morning sermon that I've gone to. But at the same time, and maybe this is more doing comedy stuff with Chris, I don't know, you can be in these secular spaces where the mere mention of a spirituality or faith or religion will put people's guard up, or it will be seen as a taboo thing, or again, it's that idea of it has to be one or the other. And so me and Chris, because of who we are, because of what we want to write, there are a few things about our act in that we don't swear. A lot of it is quite uplifting, but then in comedy, if you're billed as family friendly, people think you're sort of like Dick and Dom in the bungalow throwing slime on each other or whatever. And whereas we love that, you can have a 7-year-old in the front row and you can be singing about Monopoly, and then the next song you can actually be singing about, you know, Assalamu alaikum and peace be on earth and those kinds of things. And so, but we have been on mixed bills where other comedians have seen children in the front row and suddenly gone, oh my goodness, have I got any routines that doesn't have anything offensive in it? And a lot of my favorite comedians, by all means, do use, you know, offensive language, and they make a good point. And I don't think that it's one or the other, but I think for me, it's always been so intertwined in who I am. And because I started writing as I was a teenager, as I grew up, as I grew confidence in myself, my art is an extension of that. And so because my faith feeds into who I am, that naturally comes through as well. But quite early on, I was hesitant about not just wanting to write quote unquote Christian poems, or poems that were explicitly about a Bible verse, or that would only make sense to people who already believe the same thing as me. I thought it was important to find stories, you know, as with the Bumblebee, stories that can be inspiring and uplifting, and for me have a parable aspect to them, but also that you would hope anyone could get something from, and you can kind of meet people where they are. And I think that's one of the amazing things about art, and for me specifically poetry, is that any number of people can listen to it and get something from that. And so hopefully I put enough of my faith into it that if people want to, that comes through. I'm not trying to hide it or sneak it under the radar necessarily, but I, until recently, hadn't written much explicitly Christian referencing poems, because it didn't feel like where I wanted to be in that moment, I guess.
Yeah. You say until recently, have you been sort of pushed?
Well,
have you decided to go down that line?
Yeah, I think it's partly just I'm more comfortable in my faith now, probably, and I don't feel the need to say I'm a Christian, but and you know, I think where I'm at, I get that people have different ideas of what it is, but I know where I'm at with it. But for example, I was asked to write a poem for Radio 4 that was reflecting on the Easter story, and it was broken down into different parts. And so actually it's a poem about food and friendship, but it's also reflecting on the Last Supper. And for me, that was such a helpful angle to see it through. And then also I've been doing these pause for thoughts on Radio 2, and almost every time I submit my idea and the feedback is, it's great, but could you just make it a bit more religious? And I realized that it's too subtle for a specific demographic, because that is actually a 2-minute slot where you're asked to speak about faith. And so I think there are different contexts and audiences where it feels more or less appropriate to talk about faith, or to talk in a context where you expect people to get something from it. And you know, I feel very fortunate that as well I can perform at a music festival, or similarly I can perform in a church hall, and there are naturally different references people get or people will lean into, the same way that if you've got a comedy audience, they're more likely to want to laugh, whereas if you've got a poetry audience, hopefully they're more likely to listen or reflect or look for those kind of deeper meanings. And so I'm very happy I can occupy both those spaces, but I'm also on a learning journey of working out how much of these different spaces you bring into other places, if that makes sense.
That does makes really good sense. If you've got another poem you'd like to kind of perform for us, doesn't have to relate exactly to what we were just talking about. Have you got something? And just a reminder to anyone, if you haven't got any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, so I don't, otherwise I'll just ask all mine.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, this poem, I'm trying to make it relate. It's one that I performed on Pause for Thought, so it was deemed religious enough and relevant enough, but also it feels relevant because this week was the next stage of restrictions easing, and we've been told we're allowed to hug people again, whether or not people are comfortable doing that yet. But I wrote this quite early on during lockdown, and it was part of my journey of writing more reflective things and trying to mark these moments in time, because I think poems are an incredible way of taking a snapshot of things, especially when there is so much uncertainty out there. So it was written looking forward to the moment when we would be able to hug each other again. And so currently that place is here, and that feels very exciting. Who knows what's still to come, but it was called When This Is Over, and it was yeah, looking forward from that place of uncertainty. When this is over, I will hold you closer than you've ever known. When you see me, you can squeeze me till you feel my very bones. How I long to let you know that I won't want to let you go. There will be so much left to say, yet still some things are better shown. I will wrap my arms around you for the seconds we have lost. Our words will find a way to wait as we locate the weight of us. Though we are changed, there stays a sense of same about the way we touch. Though it is strange, we will embrace how long it takes us to adjust. The world of everything we knew is somewhere we cannot return. The world of everything that's new is one we'll build from what we've learned. We'd never know ashes could rise again until we'd seen them burn. And the next time I'm stood in front of you, we'll feel like it's been earned. Because when the start has given way, it's only then the end can enter. When the heart is given space, it will forever tend to tender. These affections kept at bay can once again descend to center. Something will have come to yearn as hummingbirds connect to nectar. For all those overwhelming moments where I felt like giving up, there is no point where I was worried we'd forgotten how to love. And when the future's all we've got, well, then that's got to be enough. All that I know is when I'm low that I have wanted to be hugged. And if you'd rather have a handshake, that is absolutely fine. Even a wave from me is saying, I am glad that you're alive, whichever form it takes. When this has passed and we've started again, I will no longer take for granted any chances to connect. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thanks, Barry. That's really beautiful. I'll ask you a few questions a bit more about pause for thought in a minute, because we've gone there. But actually, before I do that, I'll read this question out, otherwise I'll forget. Well, this is Ruth again. You can tell she's a poet, and she asks, "Do you think poetry has a place within public dialogue and discourse?" That's leading, isn't it? If so, what role do you think poetry has in public life?
Yes, I think there's been a temptation, I think, among poets or contemporary poets to try and rebrand it as this new, cool, exciting thing. But actually, poetry has been around as long as we have, and public discourse, and it has always been a way, I think, especially of marking the bigger moments. And so things that I have seen that have moved me are poems at weddings or at funerals or at christenings. And actually it tends to be these occasions that we look to verse and we look to people to put these things into words. And one example in more recent history was there's a poet called Tony Walsh, who is from Manchester. And after the Manchester bombing, he read his poem the next day at this public mourning ceremony. And it was a poem he already had about the city, but it put into feeling something that everyone thought that day. And everyone around the world who saw that poem got it and realized that that was actually what people needed to hear then and there. And something about the way those words were put together tapped into that moment. And actually, for me, on a smaller scale, writing a poem about wanting to hug people, at that moment, lots of people could relate to that because we were in this new experience and we hadn't got used to what that might be. And so people were grateful for someone else putting this into words. And so I think poetry is a very helpful way of articulating what is in a sense the everyday, but trying to do it in a way that cuts through. And I guess for me, the temptation is to wait an amount of time until your thoughts have crystallized, and so you can look back and reflect on it. Whereas if it's going to be leading discourse and that kind of thing, then maybe you are looking at quicker, more responsive things. But I think art in general does have a way of shaping opinion. And I think it is almost a radical act to step back and take a moment and process the world around you, because it feels like we are under pressure these days to instantly form an opinion about everything and know what we feel and know what we want to do. And so for me, poetry is a way of resisting that, and it is a way of being thoughtful and being open to what the world might want to offer you.
Sure.
I don't know if that answers the question, but it's
So
sort of
it made me think a bit of sort of on a huge scale. Amanda Gorman, her poem
yes.
at Biden's inauguration, that was kind of in that really kind of
Yeah, and I think that's a fantastic example where you have politicians there with 50 years of experience, and yet it was the 21-year-old poet who cut through and who spoke to everyone. And I'd never heard her work before, but was completely mesmerized and transfixed, and as were so many other people, and lots of people who would say they didn't like poetry even. In that moment, it spoke to the whole world. And I think there is a sense of occasion about that, but also it is the performance and the writing and all of that combined. And I think that's what I mean when I say poets can feel like prophets, because it was this young, strong voice that just cut through everything. And that felt like a pleasure to be able to witness.
yeah, absolutely. So, so you've referenced Pause for Thought and shared a poem in there. You're quite new to doing Pause, reasonably new to doing Pause for Thought.
Yes, so I did 3 in a row just before Christmas, and then I'm on a stretch of doing another 3. So I mean, there was about a year before that when I think I was on, so let's say probation. I was on trial, so I had to send a kind of script, and there was a back and forth of trying to make it work. And yeah, I mean, I really love radio as an art form. I think because it's just the voice, and you don't have to worry about what you look like. But I think it's such a constant, and it cuts through into people's homes, and whether someone is driving or doing the washing up or whatever, especially Pause for Thought, it has that opportunity to stop them in their tracks and make them think. And so I've slowly tried to turn it into a poetry slot because that's how I'm most comfortable speaking. But also I really love being given the opportunity to give a kind of quiet reflection, and as I said, to be pushed to openly talk about stuff in a biblical context or talk about faith as well. And so yeah, I've really loved doing that.
Yeah, it's a massive and a really varied audience, I guess, as well. I wonder how
Definitely.
you almost how you begin the process of thinking I've got to speak to X amount of millions of people. You probably don't have that in your head too much as you're doing it, if you can help it. But
Yeah, and I think part of it is because of the current restrictions as well. I'm doing it from home, so I'm there, and I've got Zoe Ball on the other end of the line. So and she's very warm and encouraging, but you can't comprehend who might be listening to it. And so I mean, it's nice because you get to practice it, and then you're reading it off a page. So it's not a sense of having to make stuff up on the spot. But I think I've been really uh, touched by the response that it's had, because again, I think people aren't necessarily expecting it in that moment. And whether it is a poem or just a more tender piece of prose, I think it's an amazing thing to have on the radio. And especially the last time I did it, I was speaking to the producer, and the way he phrased it made me laugh, because they were doing like an all request song Monday. And he said, right, so we've got 3 bangers and then we've got you. And I thought, I mean, I really like that. And I like that it slots in amongst it in that way. But it's been an amazing experience to do.
yeah. Will it always be poems?
No, and so I've tried to shoehorn a couple of poems in, but also I've changed it, and it's interesting because it feels you're trying to be relevant and current, but things are always changing, and especially with COVID. So just before Christmas, the first one I did, I just spoke openly about how excited I was to see my nieces for Christmas, and how we see the kingdom of heaven through the eyes of a child, and how it was going to be amazing. And then I think 3 days later, it was announced that we weren't allowed to go home for Christmas anymore. And so I couldn't see it, having told millions of people that I really wanted to. And so actually the next week, I was able to do a poem about hugging because it made me feel better. And similarly, this Monday just gone, I shared a poem about events that had been rescheduled, whether it was weddings or whether it was poetry gigs. And actually, on the day, there wasn't quite the same euphoric tone of everything's opened up again. There was this more cautious tone of there is a new variant. So you're able to go to things, but maybe you don't want to. And so I don't want to be there being like, right, guys, let's all pack in a basement and listen to poems, because you've got to judge the mood. And so also it's made me realize that you can't be too prescriptive or try and write things 6 months in advance. And so it kind of has forced me to reflect on my day to day in the lead up to it, to think about what might feel helpful or inspiring to be able to share.
Sure. How far in advance do you have to write them?
So I mean, I'm on the Monday morning slot to save the producer working over the weekend. I try and send it on a Friday, and then
So it's fairly close to.
yeah. But then if I get an email back saying this is all wrong, then I'm sure it will go closer to the line. That's not happened yet.
Debbie's just asked the same question as I asked. I also have to include poetry in people's thought or other reflections. Question from Peter. I'm just aware of time, but this is a good question. Well, this is it's subjective, but which 3 great poets from the past would you like to meet?
That's a good question. Recently, I have completely fallen in love with Mary Oliver. I don't know what counts as the past, but hopefully she does. And she has a quote in one of her poems which says, "Instructions for living a life: pay attention, be astonished, tell about it." And I think if I was ever going to get a tattoo, it would be those words, because that for me just sums up the spirit of what both poetry and living is. And when I first started out, I was trying to sort of be this exciting performance slam poet. And so by doing that, you push against, I guess, more traditional ideas of what poetry was. And so I would kind of say it's more than just poems about clouds and daffodils, but actually Mary Oliver, by and large, writes about nature in just the most stunning way that completely stops me in my tracks. And it's made me rethink what poetry is and what it can be. And she is someone who's incredible at talking about God as nature and in amongst it. And I don't think many people would class it as religious poetry necessarily, but there is such a spirituality to it that to me it feels like prayer. And so I would love to meet her.
Say that quote again for us.
Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it.
Sounds like I'll write my sermon on Sunday. There we go.
Maybe that'll be my pause for thought next week.
Perfect. And 2 others, sort of briefly.
So 2 others from the past. Emily Dickinson, just because my wife is a big fan, and I could tell her things. She's just walked in, so I'm partly saying that to impress her because she's listening. And then finally, again, I mean, Shakespeare. He's got some poems. If we're going proper, otherwise I'd just name contemporary poets. So this is me trying to show I've heard of poets from the past.
Yeah, I'd be scared to get asked that question. I'd be okay. Right. We're coming towards the end of time. So if there's any final questions from anyone, please do stick them in the chat. I just want to ask one question because I've heard you talk about it a bit, and I referenced it a bit at the beginning of one a couple of years ago. I think it was when we booked you for Recreate, and you had to at the last minute bail out and go to America. Do you want to if it's not too painful, can you tell us a bit about that? Just because I've heard you tell it before, and it's a brilliant story.
It is one of those things, but even as it's happening, you're thinking, one day this will make a good story, and that's partly what gets you through. So I would give a truncated version, because we ended up writing an hour-long show about this because there was so much that was completely bonkers. But essentially, me and Chris, having written these uplifting songs that you could call comedy if you wanted to, were invited to go on an American talent show called Bring the Funny. So think Britain's Got Talent or America's Got Talent, but specifically for comedians. And so they'd reached out to, we were told it was a very international audience. It turns out it was mostly Americans, and then us and a puppet from Australia. And they were, but like any kind of talent show, you're given sort of 2 minutes in front of the judges. And there was Keenan from Keenan and Kel, which excited us because we grew up with that. And then there was Chrissy Teigen, who's this huge personality, but we weren't that familiar with. And then Jeff Foxworthy, who was this American comedian legend, but again, we had no idea who it was. And we went up there, and when we went, the sort of couple of days before recording, we thought we'd go to a local open mic night just to check that the same stuff sort of makes sense. But the open mic night we went to was in a fried chicken restaurant, and we performed our song, and no one laughed at all at anything. And we thought, it is too late in the day to completely change both our act and personalities. What can we do? And so we kind of reworked it, and we went on and performed in this first round, and like just about got through, but realized that I speak too fast. For one, we've got weird accents, all our cultural references are off, and they don't. American, I don't want to generalize everyone, but American humor tends to be about big, obvious things. And I think British humor, one of the things I love about it is the subtlety and the nuance and the kind of irony and that kind of thing. And so we were making lots of sort of half jokes, and none of them made any sense. And so for our second round, while we were there, we just rewrote a song about the difference between England and America. And it was big and it was over the top, and it went a lot better, but we ultimately still went out. But it was just completely surreal to be over there and be doing this thing. And things like, to get over there, they did a check of all of our social media stuff anywhere, because if we were to become these huge celebrities, they didn't want it to kind of come out. And so we got sent lists of things that we wrote when we were 13, just to flag in case we got asked about. And so all of this was so strange for us. And everyone there, it was their big break, and they were there to make America and that kind of thing. And we were just like so pleased to have each other. And we also had to do an interview before we went on stage, and they were saying things like, you know, this competition is going to make or break you. The prize is $250,000. What are you going to do with that money? And Chris just said, please stick it in an ISA. And it was so far from the big American dream that I don't think they really got us. But again, like these worst gig scenarios, it made us so appreciative to come back and perform to 15 people in a basement, because actually it felt like they got us and we were home again. And yeah, I loved it, and I would never do it again. That is my summary of the experience.
Fair enough. Well, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to maybe finish with one poem for us. But do you want to tell us? I think you mentioned a bit, but what are you working on? How can people kind of connect with you? What you're writing? Obviously, they can catch you on Pause for Thought on a Monday on radio.
Yes. So at the moment, fingers crossed, I have rescheduled gigs that I was meant to do last year. And so in June and July, I'm going to be out performing again. But the joy of this modern world that we're now in is that the first couple will be live streamed as well. So whether or not you are in Manchester or Maidenhead, you know, you can watch it from home. So if people want to see a live performance, the difference will be that there will be some audience in the room. So hopefully that atmosphere will come through as well. But other than that, I am working on my second collection of poems. So I've had a lot more time to write. Normally I would work that out on stage and on the road. And so it's kind of flipped that on its head. So I'm really excited to have these gigs and have a chance to work it out in front of a crowd, but also at some point it will be in book form, whether that is in the next year or two. That's the next big project. And in the meantime, it's a combination of live gigs and Zoom gigs and making our way in this new blended world.
Well, there's Harry's first book, which is probably all flipped around the wrong way for you. There is Sunshine Kid.
Harry, I'd just like to say how inspiring it has been to listen to you tonight.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Debbie. Can I ask just one question, because it just came to me when you were speaking. I'm always fascinated about comedians or musicians, people, the whole touring thing. Right? Is it fun or is it horrendous? Just going from place to place night after night. Do you get to see anything of it? Each place?
Yes, so I completely love it, and I've also had a chance to reflect. And so this is the longest I've been in one place, and for the last 18 months, and I've completely loved that as well. And I think it's made me reflect on, if you are going to be away from home, it has to be worth it. And so I no longer want to perform to zombies in Birmingham, but actually to perform to an audience of people. There's something about that live element even if you're doing the same poems in 100 different places, it will feel different. And so to be able to be on tour is amazing because people are there to see you, or they know what to expect. And so it's not quite the same as a festival gig where they might be wandering through, and there's the joy of trying to win people over, but actually at a tour show, you've got longer and you've got a chance for people to get on board, and you can do old stuff and new stuff. And so that in particular, I'm really excited about. I mean, the first time I went on tour with Chris was amazing because also you're there with your mate and you can debrief afterwards. And if it's great, you've got a friend there. And if it's awful, you've got a friend there. So that's been really nice. But I think, yeah, I do love touring, but I'm also aware of how precious it is to have time at home and try and find that balance.
Sure. And are you coming down our way, down to sort of Dorset, South Coasty type?
Yes, so I'm finishing off the previous dates I had in, but then in autumn I'm going to be putting new ones in. Okay. But we've just been hesitant to add new dates because we've not been able to do the old dates. So at some point there will be some when I will be able to come down. So as soon as they're confirmed, I will let you know, and would love to see some of you there.
Well, thank you so much. I know you've had a busy day and sort of various things going on. It's been a privilege to have you with us for our little humble gathering this evening. Would you finish with a poem for us?
Yes, I would love to. So this poem is called Impossible, and I finished writing it on the 16th of March last year, and I performed it once in a kind of theatre, and then everything closed down, and I've not performed it on a stage since. And it was broadly about climate change, but more so about a feeling of helplessness and being overwhelmed by the world. And turns out there's plenty of things that overwhelm us, and so it feels like it's now a COVID poem in the same way that so much feels framed by the past events of the year. But it's in the same way I found the story of the bumblebee inspiring and helpful. It's looking at the world around us as an encouraging thing and thinking if the world's not given up on us, then we shouldn't give up on it. And it goes like this. I'm finding it too easy to tell myself things are too hard. When facing the end, that it's too late to even make a start. But if we take impossible to mean that we don't have a chance, we have lost sight of how unlikely it was we would get this far. The way the single fish outwits the shark by sticking with its school. The way the crescent moon outspins its dark to once again be full. Even winter, given long enough, begins to lose its cool. That which was once exceptional now barely registers at all. Flamingos and giraffes look like the word drawn by a child. We can't begin to comprehend all of the ways this world is wild. None of them asked if they were possible before they came to be. None of them have ceased to exist by being told they're make-believe. The bug who finds it all too much and tries to shut off everything. To have recovered and then summoned up the strength to stretch its wings, the snake so full of itself that it cannot help but shed its skin, or how instead of death, the hedgehog went to bed and slept till spring. To think that Earth exists at this specific distance from the sun, down to the angle of the axis on which everything is spun, the fact that trees happen to breathe that which we need inside our lungs, it would all seem impossible had it not already been done. We are impossible to everyone who's ever gone before, and everyone who's yet to come will push impossible some more, just as indeed the do's we did outdo the don'ts we didn't. So everything's impossible until it isn't. The thought of rivers changing course before somebody gave a damn, or that a tide might turn from shore before a line's drawn in the sand. We cannot know how far our actions go, the impacts they might have. Sometimes the only thing that we can do is to do what we can. Just as the night is at its darkest when it's introduced to day, just as the dry is at its harshest in the breath before it rains. It's easy enough to believe in something when it's all okay, but it's when times are at their hardest that it's hardest to have faith. Yet when the light begins to fade, that's when we need it the most. It's by surviving day to day that we see seasons evolve. It could be too late to do anything. It sure as hell is if we don't. And I am tired of that doom and gloom and self-fulfilling prophecies. I'm trying to find room to bloom and self-fulfill the opposites. When it's an act of revolution to try stay remotely positive, there's nothing wishy-washy about opting to be optimists. Whether a brighter future is possible, we may not truly know. But the first step towards that future is imagining it so. And so as indeed the do's we did outdo the don'ts we didn't. So it remains impossible until it isn't. And when it's over, and we're no more than old bones within the ground, still the soil knows to sow its seeds from what is broken down. What is lost is always lost until the moment it is found. And these things only ever go one way unless we turn them round. We are so constantly surrounded, it is easy to forget. This world was built upon impossible that has not stopped us yet. So yes, indeed, the do's we did outdo the don'ts we didn't. It only stays impossible until it isn't. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being with us. And almost like we planned it, perfectly segues into our speaker next week. Our speaker next week, who I'll be having a conversation with, is Hilary Bond, Reverend Hilary Bond, who's a climate change activist and real thinker around faith and environmental issues. So please, everyone who's come along, please do join us for our final one in this series of conversations. Yeah, come and hear Hilary speak and let people know about it. And the recording of this will be available as well, which we'll get out to you and let people catch up with the video when it goes on YouTube as well. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and have a good rest of your night. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Harry. That was brilliant.
Thank you so much.